Let's begin. The narrative. You must preserve. That's not dark enough. You must at all costs preserve the narrative. It doesn't matter what the facts say. It doesn't matter what reality says. Only the narrative matters. Today, we call it Olenskyism. Barack Obama was an Olenskyist. Hillary Clinton, Olenskyism. But Olenskyism is only Nazism. Goebbels did the same thing. Hitler's propaganda minister. Tell a lie often enough, and people will think it is the truth. Stick to the narrative. Forget about fact. Forget about reality. Stick to the narrative. You're pro-life. You're a misogynist. You're part of the war against women. Just keep repeating that. No, I'm pro-baby. Doesn't matter. You're against women. In the United States now, more women are opposed to non-therapeutic abortion than support it. We don't want to hear that. Doesn't fit the narrative. You're against women. Yeah, but these are women saying... 53% of American women voted for Donald Trump. We don't want to hear that. Doesn't matter. You're against women. You stick to the narrative. This was Pravda and Izvestia, the two news publications of the former Soviet Union. Pravda means truth in Russian, unbelievable. And it's Izvestia. Truth is not what actually happens. Truth is defined as a political decision by the party. Whatever the party decides is truth is truth. Wait a minute, abortion is killing the unborn. No, it's women's reproductive rights. It's pro-death. No, it's pro-choice. That's the narrative. We stick to the narrative. That's what happens. Second way this is happening. They understand this mentality is setting society up. Not only that, but texting. That kind of communication lends itself to sound bites, to cliches. You understand? It lends itself to mantras. So it becomes technologically facilitated, reinforced. Just go by just keep repeating this. Well, this gets in the church. We have the victory. We're going forth in triumph. Hallelujah. Now is the time of us to march upon the land. We're building a kingdom of power, not of what. No, you're not. Look at the newspaper. That's not the narrative. Yeah, but it's the mantra. You understand? Israel? The Jews have repeatedly ended up the proverbial man on back of the 8 ball. Goes back to Jacob. Very clever. He counter-maneuvered Laban. Resourceful. Yet, he wound up in a dark night of the soul. It was only God's intervention that saved his neck. The Jews would have been wiped out at least 20 times in the last 2,500 years. The Jews would have been wiped out at least 20 times apart from divine intervention. In the 1967 war, they thought it was because of them. No. It was because of God and because of the stupidity of Islam and the corruption of the Soviet Union who backed it. That's what happened. The glorification of Zionism and the glorification of Judaism. Now, I believe in the prophetic purposes of God for Israel and the Jews. I believe in Zionism, but I do not believe in the glorification of Zionism. And I certainly don't believe in Talmudic Judaism. But that's not the mantra. The mantra, Am Yisrael Hai, Am Yisrael Hai, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael. No, Am Yisrael lies. It's God's undeserved grace. It's his promise to your fathers. That's why you have survived. The narrative. The all-encompassing narrative. The next way it works is education. Education, educa, co-equally comes from 2 Latin words. Educere and educere. Etymologically similar, but 2 different meanings. Educere to lead out, to prepare someone to go out and make it on their own, using their own abilities, their own resources, their own intelligence. That's educere. But then there is educare. To mold. To mold. Educere is when you use education to teach someone how to think. Educere is where you use education to teach someone not to think. It is about conditioning. Now, this is not a new problem. Although state schools in Britain, called public schools in America, were established under Christian principles from the influences of early Methodism to give literacy and numeracy to working classes, that is true. They became conditioning plants to breed workers for labor-intensive industries. You understand? Don't think, just do this, dig in the coal mine. It was there. The teacher was like the foreman, the whole bit. Pavlov's dog, the bell rings. This is not a new problem. The elite, however, the children of the wealthy, had different schools. Grammar school, public schools. They were taught to be the managers, the entrepreneurs, the whatever. Today, educare. Taxpayer-funded schooling in the United Kingdom and the United States is not there to teach people how to think. It's to teach them not to think, to stick to the narrative. Teachers' unions on both sides of the Atlantic are political campaign funds for left-wing political parties. What these schools are for is social engineering. They are taken over by an Antichrist spirit. You must teach Darwinism. You cannot teach the alternative to it. You must teach little children homosexuality and lesbianism are normal. You cannot teach the alternative to it. Etc., etc., etc. It is there to mold people, not to think. Certainly, at least, not to think outside of the box into which they are placed. They hate charter schools. They hate homeschools. They hate faith-based private schools. Church-run schools, unless it's the C of E. Or the Roman Church. You know, the pedophile academies. They're all right. But a school that teaches God is the creator, a school that teaches Adam and Eve instead of Adam and Steve, that's not the narrative. But you have to understand, there is an Antichrist spirit on back of this stuff. Just like Zechariah shows us what Nehemiah and Ezra and Haggai were seeing taking place historically, Zechariah pulls back the curtain and shows us what's happening in heaven at the same time. The book of Daniel shows us that the political events on the earth are a mere reflection of the conflicts in the heavenlies. So it happens to education. It happens through media. and social media. Again, not a new situation. This has gone on in newspaper dynasties to the time of Citizen Kane, if you've ever seen the film about William Randolph Hearst. It's not a new problem, but now it's perfected to an art form. There's no BBC News. There's no CNN News. The news is not reported. It is editorialized along the line of the biases the establishment wants people to subscribe to. Be it selling out to Europe or whatever. The news is not reported. It is editorialized. Or if there is something that threatens the interests of those who want to perpetuate the narrative, it's either underreported or ignored. A court in Europe decreeing a teacher is guilty for teaching historical fact because Muslims objected to it. In my youth, I was a radical socialist. It was different then. There were reasons. We saw in the States the Vietnam War. And while Americans were being drafted and sent to Vietnam with no right to vote yet, the American government was having détente with Russia and China, who were supplying the North Vietnamese with the hardware to kill Americans. At the same time, the American government was telling you to go fight the communists. They were same corporations making money. Telling you go fight the communists is your patriotic duty while they're trading with the communists. Young black guys would go to Vietnam and come back and not be able to go to university in Alabama or Mississippi because they were black after supposedly fighting for the country. This drove my generation to the left, you understand? There was a reason it happened. Now, eventually I saw through it. But I'd supported militant black organizations like the Black Panthers and things like this. I supported them when I was a teenager. Now understand this. A brief lesson in American history and, of course, British colonial history. Let's just be honest about it. In the American South, under slavery, a black was considered 3/5 human by law. So white plantation owners in the South, who were all Democrat, the Democratic Party was the party of slavery, could vote their slaves for the candidate of their choice, who would always be a Democrat. There were people called Uncle Toms, blacks who collaborated with the plantation owners, whose money and investment from the cotton trade was in England, in Britain. You see this in the film Gone with the Wind, as the back tells you some of the background of what was happening at that time. And that was it. This is how you vote if you're black. That's what they did. They voted how they were told. It was always Democrat, 3/5. Black men were breeding stock. They were studs. Send them back to the field. The United States outlawed the importation of slavery well before the American Civil War, so you had to breed them internally. That's what they did. Now, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but it was the Republicans, it was Abraham Lincoln who stopped this. You understand? It wasn't Democrats. After the Civil War, after emancipation, came Reconstruction. But it was the same thing. Slavery with a different name. You just found a way to lock a black guy up, put him on a chain gang. It just continued with a different name. Now, under Bill Clinton, the black American prison population tripled. What do you do with a black? Well, 3 out of 4 black American children are born out of wedlock. He's just a stud. The others are on welfare. He's just a breeding stock. Lock him up, put him in chains, handcuff him, send him back to jail. Can't get a job, you gave it to an illegal alien. So you get Uncle Toms. Barack Obama and these guys vote Democrat. It's the same thing that's always happened, you understand? It's the same thing. Hold the black man down, hold the Hispanic down, the American Indian. It's always the same game. But the narrative is, no, listen to Uncle Tom. This is getting worse. What's really odd is Hispanics and blacks who see through this and who try to warn and say, look, this is a lie. They're hated by the black establishment who have a vested interest as Uncle Tom's collaborating with this corruption. Well, it's the narrative. It's the media. Then you have the gentrification. San Francisco is a mess. But there are nice neighborhoods, and a lot of those nice neighborhoods used to be slums. Now, property developers buy those slums for a song or a pittance, often with the taxpayer subsidy, redevelop them as housing for people who work in Silicon Valley, which is in the suburbs of San Francisco. So instead of having people in the suburbs commuting to work in the city, you have people who live in the city and commute to work in the suburbs. They have Google buses, and it's the opposite of traditional social economic environment. They work in the suburbs, live in the cities. Who gets forced out of these neighborhoods? Blacks and Hispanics. Who runs this system? Who funds it? George Soros, Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, who not only runs Amazon, he owns the left-wing Washington Post. Why will billionaires, multi-billionaires, fund a left-wing political party? Why will the banksters of Wall Street want Clinton and Obama? Why? Because it's in their interest. If you can bamboozle people into following the narrative, oh no, they're for the rich, we're for the people, we're Antifa, it's all a lie. It's all a lie. There's super wealthy people pushing this. You think they're doing it because they're idealists? You think they're allowing people to come into the United States from Central America illegally to take jobs away from Mexican Americans because they're idealists? They want to pay the cheap wages. So the next thing that happens is victimization. You're the victim. You're in this situation because you're the victim. A child born out of wedlock in the United States of any race is much less likely to finish high school and much more likely to wind up in the criminal justice system at some point in his youth. You're the victim? That 3 out of 4 Afro-American children are born out of wedlock? The civil rights movement came out of Christianity. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These were people who had faith-based values. That's all gone. Now, you're the victim. South Africa. Apartheid has been over for 20 years or more. You're the victim. What's happening? African black African unemployment has more than doubled since the end of apartheid. Black underemployment is incalculable. Infant mortality has gone through the roof. Longevity has gone through the basement. Now, I was deeply, outspokenly opposed to apartheid. It was racist and unjust. But after 20 years of the ANC, the average black is far worse off. You know David Royal, yeah? We take care of AIDS kids in Africa. Uganda is the same. The tribalism is not the fault of European colonialists that you see in Kenya and in Uganda and Tanzania. But you got to perpetuate the victim mentality. Now, countries that do not do that. Has anybody been to Singapore? What was Singapore in the late 1960s? A slum-cluttered island. What is Singapore now? It's unbelievable. Don't be the victim. Be the victor. Upward mobility, work, study. Perpetuate the victim mentality. They do it in Northern Ireland with the Catholics. They do it in Northern Ireland with the Catholics. You perpetuate the victim mentality. As long as you make somebody think that they're the victim perpetually, to the point where they don't have to be responsible for their own actions and own decisions, they will always remain the low man on the totem pole. And you'll always have their vote because you're showing sympathy to the victim. They redefine morality. Instead of you get married and you have children within the confines of wedlock and you bring them up in a stable family and they have a father who's a role model and things like this, no, you destroy the family. Instead of morality being defined by personal righteousness, moral living, morality becomes redefined as your position on social policy. Are you green enough? Now, all these things I'm telling you seem like mere social commentary. They seem to be merely socio-political commentary. But understand something. There is a spirit on back of this stuff that is setting the stage for the Antichrist and false prophet. Remember, you'll be brought before magistrates and kings. We've pointed this out before. You replace legislative or parliamentary government with bureaucratic and judicial government. Bureaucratic, executive, and judicial government. It's not Parliament or Congress. It's executive orders ruling by fiat. Barack Obama made a treaty with Iran. Yeah, but it's not constitutional. The Senate has to approve the treaty. Oh, yeah, but he did it by fiat. Mr. Trump got rid of it. He shouldn't have done that. No, the treaty should have been made to begin with, unless it was approved by the Senate. Executive? What's happening with Theresa May? Is it parliamentary or is it executive? Bureaucratic. An entrenched bureaucracy making the real decisions in Brussels. And when it's challenged in court, the judicial. Judges who legislate from the bench, replacing the legislative and parliamentary. Now understand this, when you get to issues like pro-life, Mr. Trump, for instance, knows judges are going to decide these things. The American people never would have voted for same-sex marriage. The Supreme Court imposed it. Therefore, he's got to get conservative judges. You saw the thing with Kavanaugh over here in the news? There's a spiritual battle on back of that dealing with abortion and other things. The whole thing with moving the embassy to Jerusalem is another dimension. The next thing that happens in preserving the narrative, pay attention, is what George Orwell called newspeak, what we call political correctness. Call it what you want. You redefine things. I'll give you an example. Redefinition of language. Comes from something called Deconstructionism, associated with the French Jewish philosopher in the 1960s. Somebody of considerable fame at that time, Jacques Derrida. Scientifically, male and female, term is sex. It has to do with chromosomal identity, X and Y. Scientifically, sex can only be chromosomally determined as X and Y. That's it. However, in the Greek language, to a degree in Latin language, and in certain other European languages, the masculine can take the feminine form And the feminine can sometimes even take a masculine form. For instance, in Spanish, mapa. Well, that should be a feminine word, but you don't say la mapa, you say el mapa. It takes the masculine article, doesn't it? El mapa. Es verdad. El mapa. In Greek, the masculine of rock is Petros, but Jesus is called in Corinthians the Petra. Gender is not to do with sex as a linguistic term. Gender is to do with the way a word is used in the construction or context of a sentence. Gender. We call it masculine, feminine, or in some languages masculine, feminine, or neuter, but it's not about X and Y. It's about the way a word is used in a particular context that determines if it's masculine or feminine. So, in deconstructionism, you replace the term sex with gender. Gender identity. You can't say sexual identity, because that would mean that the chromosomes in every cell in someone's body is going to determine if they're male or female. Being surgically altered to resemble someone of the natural opposite sex is not going to change the DNA in every cell of someone's body. Scientifically, you can't do it. So you do it with semantics. You do it with language. You make the term gender, a linguistic term, into a pseudo-scientific term. You understand? In deconstructionism of Derrida, it began as a form of literary criticism, where the assumptions about identity and truth are brought into question because words are thought to refer to other words. This gained momentum among left-wing intellectuals, particularly in France, and then began permeating the academic establishment of other countries, including Britain and America. Okay? You deconstruct the traditional meaning and give a new one. Well, what happens when this gets into the church? When people in word faith churches that follow the money preachers, when they use words like faith and victory and even prosper, they mean something quite different than the scripture means by those terms. Now, this also can relate to Gnosticism, where some people mean different things by the same terms than you do, but keeping it philosophical. They'll use terms with a different definition. You deconstruct traditionally held understandings of identity and truth. Well, constitutionally, deconstructionists hate the Constitution. They hate any kind of Constitution. The American Constitution, like the British Magna Carta, any of these things, they are all theistic documents. And it was understood at the time of their framing, drafting, and signing that they referred to the God of the Judeo-Christian scriptures. That has to be deconstructed. You understand? It could be the God as I understand him, or the God as I'm. Could be the God, could be Buddha, could be... This is Prince Charles. Prince Charles. It goes on. Now look. What happens again when it gets in to the church? Left-wing evangelicals. Has any of you heard of the American Tim Keller? Huh? You understand what this is? It's deconstructionism applied theologically as well as politically. You deconstruct the original understanding of the meaning. You attack the foundations. You teach it in schools. Dictatorial pastors, egomaniacs, religious narcissists, people like Steve Furtick. He's the worst I personally have seen, but he's not the only one. What's in back of this stuff? Well, the narrative. It's always the narrative. But it's not God's narrative. It's the narrative of the cosmos. It's the narrative of the cosmon. It is the narrative driven by a spirit of Antichrist that is setting the stage for the Antichrist. That's what it is. It relates to many things. To the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. It relates to many things. It relates to the technosphere. It relates to many things, but it comes down to one basic thing that 1 John tells us. The cosmos and the cosmon. The system. The narrative. The myth treated as fact. In the first century, the demon-possessed bisexual emperor Caligula said his daughter was a son and arranged the marriage ceremony to a horse, legally recognized. You want to talk about animal rights? The difference is, in those days, although it was legally established, that's how far the Roman Empire went into depravity. Now, in the last days, or in these days, such things can to a degree be technologically facilitated. You understand? At least the illusion of it. There was no way then to make a male resemble a female surgically. Now they can do it. I can understand this. I used to be a man trapped in a woman's body. But then I was born. And I'm not the only one who said that, believe me. You understand what this is? Before John talks about Antichrist, and many Antichrists, and we will know it's the end when this Antichrist stuff begins to intensify and multiply in preparation for the arrival of the Antichrist and the false prophet. We know that this is preceded, verse 16, by the cosmos and the cosmon. Now there's something else. Do you know how many people doing this stuff? Not all of them, but a disproportionately large percentage of them are Jewish. Now, they will not tell you, anti-Semites will not tell you that the people opposing it, like Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager and Mark Levin and Michael Savage, they won't tell you that the people who are opposing it and warning against it are disproportional numbers Jewish also. They won't tell you that. The anti-Semites will just say Jews are doing this. You understand? Yet there's no question. The same as there's a disproportionate number of Jews warning against it. There's a disproportionate number of left-wing Jews doing it. Soros being one. Zuckerberg. There's a final thing they are doing now. Deplatformization. And I will leave with this. In deplatformization, Norwegian cruises have done this. MasterCard has done this. Facebook has done this. It gets worse and worse. So many of them are doing it. Universities are doing this. You deprive dissenting voices of a platform to put across the opposing point of view. The fact that Darwinism is not scientific, you can't say that. It's not the narrative. You cannot have a scientist who will challenge it, deplatform them. Antifa are the most fascist people in the world. They're anti-free speech. They do not want intelligent debate. They want people reacting emotionally. Not people who think, but people who've been conditioned by the school system not to think. The universities want people who can't think. So they ban conservative speakers, pro-life speakers, anything like this. Of two things we may be sure. The Menelaus effect. Menelaus the Jew collaborated, as Daniel predicted, with Antiochus. Major picture of the Antichrist. The abomination. Menelaus is coming back big time. You will see a betrayal of the Jewish people and of Israel facilitated by left-wing Jews. It's already begun in America. It has already begun in the United States. And you will see a betrayal of the body of Christ, not just by left-wing so-called Christians, but by left-wing professing evangelicals. Gary Burge, Stephen Sizer, Tim Keller, and others, and more to come. That is what is happening. It'll go against Israel. It'll go against the church, the true church. The left-wing Jews will attack traditional Jewish identity, Jewish preservation. The same thing will happen within the church. Our identity, our very identity in Christ will be challenged and is being challenged by people like Steve Chalk in this country. It's happening. No, there's a reason. There's a reason where it says Before this Antichrist, it's prefaced, love not the cosmos, neither the cosmon. Understand this. It is the world's system. It is demonically operated. The world is in the power of the wicked one. When you read a newspaper, and don't read one, read this. You cannot believe them. You can't believe them, but you can believe this. This you can believe. The cosmos and the cosmon. This is the reality. These trends you see in society, in governments, Brexit, the hatred of Trump, all these things, they are reflections of spiritual conflicts, and they all concern us. Every one of these things concerns us. We are supposed to understand this. You can't understand the cosmos unless you understand the cosmon. Tonight, in a nutshell, I hope by the grace of God, I've done my best to make sure you understand it, to explain it to you. We are not to be naive about these things. If you've watched This Week in Prophecy, our last one, it hinged on a verse in Daniel, and then we'll go to sleep. Turn with me to Daniel 2, please. Verse 21, it's he who changes the times and the epochs, that's the Lord. He removes kings and establishes kings. He's responsible with governments. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. Ultimately, the Lord is the Lord of these events. It doesn't happen unless he allows it. Sometimes he causes it. But he wants us. He wants you and he wants me to be wise men and women. He gives us wisdom. Jesus is our wisdom. And knowledge to men and women of understanding. This is not just an academic lecture. Make sure you understand this. The cosmos and the cosmon. God bless. Have a good night.